Hello and welcome to this video podcast for evolution and diversity. In this video, we're going to continue our discussion of the key innovations and adaptations we see in animals. And we're going to talk about muscle tissues, skeletons, nervous tissues, circulatory systems, gas exchange, excretory systems, and reproduction. So let's go ahead and get started with muscle tissue. Now, I want to divide our discussion up by phyla. And the first category here is going to be no muscles. And you might have guessed it, it's the periphery, as they seem to be our lone outcasts often when we talk about these features. And then I'm going to talk about a muscle system called the epithelial muscular cells. This includes our two diploblasts, ctenophora and cnidarians. And remember, these are diploblasts. And then I'd like to talk about the organisms, or the phyla, that have true muscle tissue. And this includes all the other phyla, or more specifically, it includes all the triploblasts. So one thing that all three of these categories have in common is that they all contain proteins that are important in contraction. Even the periphery have proteins that are important in contraction, even though they don't have muscles. These two proteins are actin and myosin. So these two proteins, actin and myosin, are important in cellular contraction. And so they aid the organism in many different things, including movement, circulation, like blood circulation, digestion, and heat production. And there are some other functions as well. So we're not going to spend a ton of time talking about all of this, but I do want to show you a diagram of what epithelial muscular cells look like, and a diagram of what muscle tissue looks like, and the three types of muscle tissues that we see in animals. So here's a diagram of epithelial muscular cells, and this is a cross-section through hydra, which is a diploblast, and so it doesn't have the mesoderm, and if it doesn't have the mesoderm, then it won't be able to make muscle tissues. And so these epithelial muscular cells, they are derived from the ectoderm. And they're able to sense the environment because they do have these sensory cells. And so they sense the environment and they can send signals along the base of all of these epithelial muscular cells. And it allows these cells to work in unison to contract or relax. And that helps the hydra, in this case, move, and often moving towards a food source. These cells are not as advanced and are not as elaborate as we're going to see in true muscular tissues, which we'll see on the next slide. So let's talk a little bit about muscle tissue. Muscle tissue is a specialized tissue found in animals, and more specifically in triploblasts. The muscle tissue functions by contracting and applies force to different parts of the body, and as I said on the whiteboard, that helps it move, it helps it digest, it helps in blood circulation, it helps in digestion. A lot of different functions are important for this. As I said, they're only found in triploblasts, which makes sense because the difference between a diploblast and a triploblast is that the triploblast has the embryonic tissue of the mesoderm, which produces muscle cells. Now, within the muscle classification, we can group them into skeletal muscles, and these are going to be those that are found along the skeleton, as the name might imply to you, and it helps in movement. Smooth muscles we find throughout the body, and they will often line some of the blood vessels and the digestive tract to help in movement of food through our digestive system and help with blood moving through our circulatory system. The heart has a specialized kind of muscle tissue, and it's called the cardiac muscle. And it's only found in the heart, and it functions in the contraction of our heart, which also, of course, helps in blood circulation. As I mentioned on the first slide talking about the muscles, we have these three categories. Either there's no muscles, or they have the epithelial muscular cells in the ctenophora and cnidarians. And then there are those that have true muscle tissue, and those include the ones listed here. Remember, they all have contractile proteins. Even periphery has contractile proteins of actin and myosin. Okay, let's spend a little time talking about skeletons. There are three main kinds of skeletons that we're going to talk about, but in general, they all provide protection to soft tissues. So soft tissues would include the tissues that make up our digestive system, our heart, our reproductive systems, and other kinds of organs and tissues. They also provide something for muscles to pull against to produce movement. The three kinds of skeletons we're going to talk about include a hydrostatic skeleton. So a hydrostatic skeleton is a skeleton formed by a fluid-filled compartment within the body. That is the coelom. The next one is the exoskeleton. And this is a hard external covering for the body in some invertebrates. Particularly, we see this a lot in arthropods. And the third one is the endoskeleton. The endoskeleton is an internal skeleton. And we would see this in animals that have a bony or cartilage-based skeleton. I'd like to show you a couple pictures now of each of these types of skeletons. So here's a picture of the hydrostatic skeleton. This is a cross-section through a worm. And you can see there's no outside skeleton that we're going to see with the exoskeleton. And we can see that there's no internal skeleton. Instead, what they have is this fluid here, where this arrow is pointing, that all the organs are sort of floating in. They're not really floating because they're attached to things. That fluid then will protect those organs. Now, it's not as good of protection as, say, an exoskeleton, and it's not as sturdy as, say, an endoskeleton. But it does do a pretty good job of protecting the worm or the other animals that have a hydrostatic skeleton. In exoskeleton, these are going to be mainly seen in the arthropods or the mollusks. And so you see several examples of insects here, and they all have this hard external covering that protects the animal as a whole, but also protects, of course, the organs within the animal. Same thing with the mollusks here. When the snail or a scallop, that hard outer covering there is designed to protect these organisms. And then here are some examples of bony skeletons. And so you're probably more familiar with these. This includes humans, right? We have a bony skeleton, but all these animals shown here. Now, what's not shown here are animals like the sharks, which have a skeleton made of cartilage. But that would also be considered an endoskeleton. All right, I'd like to close with a comparison of exoskeletons and endoskeletons. So the exoskeleton has to be molted when the animal grows. So essentially, as the animal grows, it has to shed its external protection. And now that leaves this animal vulnerable until it can grow a new exoskeleton. The endoskeleton, it grows with the organism. Just as we grow, our skeleton grows, and we don't have to shed anything. So it reduces that vulnerability. The exoskeleton is heavier and provides more external protection. The endoskeleton does not provide external protection. The exoskeleton limits the body size, and the endoskeleton does not limit body size. And the endoskeleton, I'm going to say down here, allows greater range of motion of limbs. Now, just a summary here of the different phyla that would have either no skeleton, hydrostatic skeleton, exoskeleton, or endoskeleton. The porifera, not surprising, they are the ones that do not have a skeleton of any kind. Hydrostatic skeleton, you can see the different animal phyla that have a hydrostatic skeleton. And then the three phyla that have an exoskeleton, the mollusks, the nematodes, and the arthropods. Endoskeleton is limited to echinodermata and chordata. Okay, let's talk about nervous systems within animals and some of the variations we see within the nervous systems. We can think of the nervous system as a collection of nerves. Now, this collection of nerves has a different degree of complexity depending upon the organisms that we're talking about, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a few moments. But regardless of the complexity of the nerves within the nervous system of an animal, its main job is to transmit signals to different parts of the body. We could list many different functions of the nervous system, but I'm just going to list a few here. It allows for the voluntary control of movement. In some animals, it's important in memory and learning. And the last one I want to mention here is the control of the body's internal environment. We can think of the nervous system as being one of two types. The first is a nerve net. And we would see this in the cnidarians and the ctenophores. And so if you think of an organism like a jellyfish, they're just floating around in the open sea. And while they do have some control of their movement, they should expect predators or food to come in any direction. So let's just write that down here. A nerve net helps them be ready to flee a predator or find food in any direction because they can sense in multiple directions. So a nerve net will conduct impulses in many directions. The nerves in the nerve net are arranged radially, which goes well with the radial symmetry that we see in these groups. And I'll show a picture of that in just a moment. Now, some animals will have their nervous system arranged in a more complex arrangement. And those animals would have something we call a central nervous system. So this is our second example here. When we talked about cephalization earlier, we talked about how the formation of the head in bilateral animals help concentrate sense organs and nerves in the head. And so that's what we're talking about here. Neurons, the nerve cells, are clustered into specific regions in the body. Unlike the jellyfish, where those nerves are radially distributed across the animal, the nervous system of bilateral animals clusters the neurons in certain areas. They're still spread out throughout the body, but we have a larger cluster in certain regions, like the brain or the spinal column. Now, animals that have a bilateral symmetry, they typically encounter the world head first. And because of that, it's important to have sense organs and those clusters of nerves in the head region. There's more advantages to that if you're encountering the world with your head first. You want to be able to sense the dangers, the predators, or food from your head. You don't really need to be able to sense that from your feet, right? So it's much more important to cluster those in your head. And in addition to the nervous tissues in our head, we'll talk in a moment about how this has also led to a lot of our sense organs, our eyes, our ears, our sense of taste, all being in this central part of our body. Okay, let's look at a quick picture here. So what we see over here on the left, this is the nerve net that we might see in a hydra, or we might see in some kind of jellyfish or something like that. And you can see how these nerves are distributed throughout the body, and there's not a clustering of them at all. And that allows this hydra to be able to respond to the environment in many different directions. Whereas we see here in the central nervous system, even in this less derived organism like the earthworm, we see a clustering of nerve cells in the head region and along the spinal column. There's still nerves, as I said, that extend throughout the body to help the body, but there's a clustering of the nerves in important regions of the body so that the worm or other bilateral animals can respond to the environment. Just a real quick summary of the kinds of nervous systems we would see in the different kinds of animals. You can see peripheria are the ones that don't have a nervous system. Nerve net we see in the ctenophora, cnidarians, and the echinodermata. Central nervous systems we see in the remaining phyla here. And then just real quick, want to close with that idea of the diversification of sensory organs and how we often see this in the head regions, or a clustering of them in the head regions. So the sense of sight we see in the head regions, that's where our eyes are. Same thing with the sense of taste and smell. Our nose and our taste buds found in our head region. Hearing found in our ear regions, as we see here with these nice massive ears. And the sense of touch. Now the sense of touch is not something that is exclusively in our head. We find them in various parts of our body. Let's go ahead and move on to the next. So this evolution of the nervous system has led to these clustering of these neurons, which has led to this really diversification of these sensory organs. So let's begin our discussion of the circulatory system. A circulatory system is a system that is made up of vessels that move blood or hemolymph to and from the heart. Real quick, you may not have heard of what hemolymph is, so let me go ahead and briefly tell you what hemolymph is. It is the substance that's moved in these vessels in invertebrates. So we find this in invertebrates. It does not have red blood cells. So blood would have red blood cells in it. And blood in many other animals is responsible for moving oxygen to and from the different organs. So hemolymph, since it doesn't have red blood cells, it's not involved in oxygen transport. Hemolymph still does some important things, of course. It transports hormones, nutrients, and metabolites. Blood can do this as well, but blood has that extra responsibility of having the red blood cells in it as well. So a circulatory system can either be an open circulatory system, or it can be a closed circulatory system. So an open circulatory system is a circulatory system in which the circulating fluid, in this case hemolymph, is not confined to blood vessels. We see this in most invertebrates. A closed circulatory system is a system in which the circulating fluid, blood in this case, is confined to blood vessels and flows in a continuous circuit. And we find this type of circulatory system in vertebrates. Okay, so let me go ahead and move to a couple pictures to show you. I should mention that there are animals that doesn't have a circulatory system. It still does have gases and nutrients that flow between the environment and the organism, and it just uses the diffusion of these materials across the plasma membrane of the organism. But let's look at these two pictures of a open and a closed circulatory system. So you see here an example of an open circulatory system, and you see the heart here where the blood will flow from, but it will fill these open spaces here that surround the different organs. So there's no blood vessels. In a closed circulatory system, we do see a heart with this continuous flow of fluid from one end of the heart all the way around, circulating throughout the body and coming back to the heart. So blood is confined to these blood vessels, and the circulation is continuous. So we have a few systems that don't have a open or closed circulatory system. The porifera, the ctenophora, the cnidarians, the rotifera, the platyhelminths, and the nematoda rely on diffusion instead of a circulatory system. In a closed circulatory system, we see some examples in the annelids. We also see some examples in the mollusks, and all chordates have a closed circulatory system. There are other members of the annelids and the mollusks that have an open circulatory system. And then arthropods also have an open circulatory system. We didn't talk about this one here, but Echinodermata, they have a different kind of system that's called a water vascular system. Okay, so let's talk about gas exchange. So gas exchange is simply the physical process by which gases move passively by diffusion across a surface. One that we're probably familiar with is how we bring in oxygen into our bodies and remove carbon dioxide. So this exchange can happen by one of four different processes. The first is through the body surface. And as the name implies, this is just the gas exchange directly across the surface of the body, so transfer across the skin. We see this in many small animals that live in moist environments. The next example are gills. These can be either external or internal. But gills are an organ that facilitate gas exchange. So we see gills in a variety of animals, including fish, mollusks, crustaceans, and even a few amphibians. The third example is the tracheal system. This is found mainly in insects. Essentially, the way this works is, if what we're looking at here is the skin and the exoskeleton of the insect, there is a tube that goes into the body. So this is the body here, and this is outside. And so this tube is directly linked to the outside and brings in gases through it into the body. This tube here is the trachea. And then the fourth type of gas exchange are the lungs. We see lungs in many animals, including mammals that live in the sea, but also land animals, of course. We see them in reptiles and birds. The lungs that we see in these different animals come in many different shapes and sizes, but essentially they function the way our lungs work. Our lungs take in oxygen from the environment, and then we exhale CO2 from our bodies back into the environment. All right, next let's talk about the excretory system. So the excretory system is a system that is responsible for eliminating metabolic waste produced by our bodies. And all I want you to know about the excretory system, besides the definition, is what we see on this slide here. And let me point out what you should know. You should know that aquatic invertebrates release their waste through diffusion across the cell membrane. And in this case, it would go directly into the water. You need to know that worms and mollusks use a system called nephridia. And these are just tiny pores along the body that is used to excrete the waste products. And then you need to know that insects use this system called the Malpighian tubule system, and it collects and excretes waste that's produced by the insects. And then lastly, you need to know that the vertebrates, like you and I, we have kidneys and ureters and a bladder that collects and excretes this metabolic waste that we generate. You should look at this as a process of going from a simple to a more complex systems of excretions. Here are the phyla that use the different kinds of excretions that we talked about. You see that these here use diffusion: Porifera, Ctenophora, Cnidarians, Nematoda, and Echinodermata. Malpighian tubules, these are the arthropods. Nephridia are the annelids and the mollusks. And kidneys are in the phylum Chordata. We didn't talk about the flame cells. You can look them up if you want, but these would be the Rotifera and the Platyhelminths. I won't ask anything about the flame cells, but they're kind of interesting. Okay, let's go ahead and move to our last topic of reproduction. We've talked about sexual and asexual reproduction, and for animals, reproduction is almost exclusively bisexual reproduction. There are a few exceptions. For instance, there are some hydra that can reproduce asexually. So when we're thinking about sexual reproduction, let's look at this life cycle of a sea urchin. And down here we see the adult, and it is diploid. And so we can say that in animals, they are dominated by the diploid state. Sea urchins will produce eggs, and other sea urchins will produce sperm, and they will fertilize. And these are the only times you see haploid cells, is in the gametes. When they fertilize, they will form a 2N zygote, like we've seen before, and then the zygote will continue to divide and differentiate throughout embryogenesis. In some animals, like the sea urchin here, they will form this larval stage, and this larval stage looks nothing like the adult. It will go through a process of metamorphosis to produce a juvenile, which looks much more like the adult, and then it will grow until it is adult size. Now, not every animal produces a larvae like this. This is common in some animals, but not all animals. In animals like vertebrates, the embryo doesn't pass through this larval stage. It continues to divide and differentiate and eventually forms a fetus, and then the offspring is born or hatched, whatever it might be. But the key here is that in animals, we're dominated by the diploid stage. We only see haploid cells as gametes, eggs and sperm. Okay, now I want to focus in on two areas. One is where does fertilization occur, and where does the embryo develop. Let's first look at where fertilization occurs. In animals, fertilization can be external or it can be internal. During external fertilization, eggs and sperm are released into the water. So this requires the animals to live in water, so we're more likely to see this in aquatic animals. But there are aquatic animals that use internal fertilization. And internal fertilization is when the egg is fertilized by the sperm internally. Now, when we think about internal fertilization, there are three different ways we can describe where embryogenesis occurs. So where does the embryo develop? So the first method of embryo development is viviparous. This occurs in species where the embryo is nourished internally. And animals that are viviparous give birth to live young. So humans would be an example of a viviparous embryo development. The next one is oviparous. Animals that are oviparous deposit a fertilized egg. You might say lay a fertilized egg in some cases. And the embryo is nourished by the yolk. So examples of this would be a chicken and crickets are both oviparous. The last one here is ovoviviparous. So this is a bit of a combination of the previous two. And animals that are ovoviviparous retain the eggs internally, but the embryo is nourished by the yolk. So they don't get nourishment directly from mom. And then they give birth to live youngs, just as the viviparous do. Some examples of species that are ovoviviparous are guppies and garter snakes, where they retain that fertilized egg. Okay, I want to introduce two terms to you that we haven't talked about yet, and they are monoecious and dioecious. Monoecious describes a species that has both male and female reproductive organs in the same individual. An example of this would be hermaphrodites. And when we see monoecious animals, they are invertebrates. Dioecious is when you have male and female reproductive organs in separate individuals. Now that we've talked about sexual reproduction in animals, I do want to go back and talk about some examples of asexual reproduction in animals. So in general, we can think of three different ways that animals can reproduce asexually. The first one listed here is parthenogenesis. And this is reproduction from a female gamete without fertilization. So you have an egg here, and through various mechanisms, it can now behave as a fertilized egg and produce an offspring without the need of a sperm. Now, parthenogenesis is rare, and we don't see it in all animal species. When we do see it, it's almost always an invertebrate. Now, every now and then, we will see it in some vertebrates, including some fish, amphibians, and reptiles, and very rarely it has been observed in birds. It's unfortunate they used an example of a reptile here, because that is more of a rare occurrence than a common one. They should have used, as an example, an invertebrate. Another way that some animals reproduce asexually is through budding, and this was the example I mentioned at the beginning of our discussion of reproduction with animals. And this is the example I used at the beginning of this section where we were talking about reproduction. And this is a hydra here, and it buds off a new hydra organism to begin its life cycle. And this one down here, fragmentation, this might be something that you've seen or heard about before with starfish. And we know that a starfish, if it breaks apart like this, that the leftover part can regenerate the missing arms of the starfish. And they do so through mitotic division, so through asexual mechanisms. So here is a list of all the phyla that have examples of asexual reproduction. And here is a list of phyla that we have seen examples of sexual reproduction. And you may notice that these two lists are strikingly
similar. In fact, they are identical. Because even though sexual reproduction is the most common amongst the animals, we do see examples of asexual reproduction in all of the phyla. Okay, that is all I have for this video podcast. If you have any questions at all, please make sure you come talk to me. If not, I will see you in class. Bye for now.